Hi, I'm Dale Peterson, and this is the first version of the new video Unsolicited Response Show. I'm changing and expanding the OT and ICS security content that we're going to put out in 2021. Now, I do this every year. We're always doing something new, trying new things, experimenting, but even more so in 2021 due to the COVID-caused cancellation of S421. Because that's where, at the beginning of each year in January down in Miami South Beach, we typically launch all these new ideas on the community. Sometimes conflicting ideas, but all sorts of new ideas on ways to really create the future, to drive progress. Unfortunately, when we canceled the event in October, we really had no choice. Obviously, no live events are happening in January, so that was a wise choice. It was a full cancellation. So we didn't decide, hey, we're going to go virtual. Now, that's not a knock on any of the events that went virtual. Each event has to decide what's right for themselves. We just didn't feel like we could create a virtual environment that has that creative experience with the activities, the atmosphere, everything that we do that makes S4 unique, from the cabana sessions to the art, and most importantly, all the people that would show up. We get this group of last year 700 best in world people together, and while I'm very proud of the content we provide on stage, the real win, the real benefit, where the most change was actually created, was in those 700 people interacting with each other. When you get that many creative best in world people together, things happen. And I don't know how many, I'm sure most of you have attended virtual events. Those of you that have attended S4, I think you can see that there was no way we could replicate that in a virtual event. So with S4 canceled and no way to launch these new ideas, we started to look for new ways of getting those ideas out there. Really the bleeding edge, unconventional, ones that are going to be a major difference to this community. Yes, we could have provided presentations for 2 or 3 days in a stream, but we thought this OTT video show that we're going to put out on YouTube and LinkedIn, and of course, we'll replay it on the podcast. And every once in a while, we'll do a live version of it. Those are kind of a high wire act and a lot of fun. But we thought that was a better way of introducing these ideas. So you can deal with one a week. Every Wednesday, we're going to do a show. Now, I'm going to read you S4's why S4 exists. And it's to unlock. Let me try that again. To unlock and set free creativity in the tribe so they can work together to create radically new solutions in an accelerated time frame that are remarkably better. So really we're talking about create new solutions faster, and not just small incremental improvements, but huge step changes. That's what we're really trying to foster. And when you think about it, the OT and ICS security community is very conservative, very slow moving. Their knee-jerk reaction is it won't work in ICS. So we're trying to push that. Now, while that's the way most of the community is, there's this subset, and a lot of them attend S4. A small part, and I think a lot of the listeners here, are people that are saying, no, that's not acceptable. That's not the way the future is going to be. And they have a lot of ideas. They're the experimenters, the early adopters, the pioneers, the people who want to try new ideas and think of new ideas. And S4 was really designed to give them a voice. So what I'm going to try to do is give them a voice on this show and promote their work. Because it's really not so much about my ideas. I mean, obviously, if you read my content, I have some strong ideas. I think I know what's going to happen or what would be best. But more important to me than getting my ideas out there is to get a lot of different ideas out there to drive this change, to find, even in some cases, conflicting ideas. Do shows with 2 different ideas on them that absolutely conflict. To do shows and have sessions that are not what I agree with, and really flesh those out and let you, the people that are going to create the future, decide what you think is important and what you should enroll in and where you should spend your time and effort to create the future. So that's really what I'm trying to do here. The first episode is going to be a little rough. The early episodes are probably going to be a little rough. You notice if you've ever watched new talk shows, they tend to be a little tough in the first editions. It takes them maybe 3 months to get their sea legs under them. And also you decide a little bit more about what the show is supposed to do or what it wants to do. Now, I have a little bit of a head start because I've done the Unsolicited Response podcast. But this is just not going to be the podcast plus video. We're going to do different things, and I think over time you'll notice that separation more. I'm sure we'll improve production values, and you'll see some of the shows will be very technical, like Stage 2 at S4, and some of them will be more from a leadership or conceptual standpoint, like what you see on the main stage at S4. One item that I would like to add to the show is we're going to try to add listener questions, not only to the show, but the podcast. And especially if you have questions on what was said in a previous episode. We're not going to restrict them to that, but we're really looking for people that say, yes, this was right, no, that was wrong, here's why, or here's a question that you didn't get into in the show. So if you have a question, you can go to dale-peterson.com, my website, and on the right side, you'll see a record your question button. You just click on that, speak into your microphone for a minute or two, and your question will come to me. Now, some of these questions we'll put on the show, and the ones that we don't put on the show, at least until the volume becomes overwhelming, I'll actually get back to you personally. So you'll get your question back answered, and you may get on the podcast as well. In addition to that, any feedback you have, in terms of what we can do to make the show better, what you like, what you don't like, and very importantly, any guests or topics you would like us to cover. You can record those as well at dale-peterson.com, or you can send them to me via email at s4@digitalbond.com. So with that as a bit of an intro, let's kick off this first show. My first guest for the first video version of Unsolicited Response is Corey Thune of Gravwell. Joining me on the first video episode of the Unsolicited Show, I guess I should call it the Unsolicited Response Show, not podcast anymore since we have video now, but it's Corey Thune, who is the founder of Gravwell, and he's a Digital Bond alumni. He worked for me for a little while, IO Active, and something people might not know about, when he worked at INL, he actually was a major contributor to Sophia, which was kind of the precursor of all these products that you're seeing from Dragos and Clarity and Nozomi and Radiflow and everyone else. He was there probably 5 years before the first products came out. So, Corey, welcome to the show.
Yeah, this is great. It's adding video components to something is always an initial challenge, but I think then we get to make funny eyes and faces at each other, and that's an important part of human interaction. So in 2021, we need it.
Yep. Well, it's funny because I wanted you on the show partially because I had some questions for you and partially because I couldn't understand what you were saying in a thread. And I think I'm probably 80% there now. But this all started, I guess, for the audience. I put out my December ICS detection analysis articles. It was actually a series of 3 articles where I, made some contentions, for example, that the sensors were going to be of little value anymore because they're going to be integrated into the switch. And I made a contention that the GUIs that your Dragos, your Nozomi, your Clarities, and others were going to have would be of little value because the information was going to be sent to a SIEM or an asset management, your QRadars, your Splunks, your ServiceNows. And after I put that out there, and I had made a bunch of other predictions, I'll link to those articles in the show notes, but you came back to me, Corey, with something, and you actually quoted one of the things that really caught me was you pointed out this article that Anton Chuvakin wrote. Did I pronounce that right? Is it Chuvakin?
I think it's Chuvakin. I think that's how he pronounces it. I met him once in person, but yeah.
Well, very smart guy. Worked for Gartner for a while. Now he's at Google. He worked for Chronicle. Now it's Google Cloud. But anyways, he said in this quote, he said, the normalized and taxonomized approach in SIEM will never actually work. It didn't work back in 2003 when it was invented, and it didn't work in any year since then, and it still doesn't work now. it probably cannot work in today's world unless some things change in a big way. And that just kind of took me back, because I thought we were going to a world where all these OT events would be sent to a QRadar or a Splunk. And I was actually excited when Splunk came out with this add-on that said, here, give it to us with this context. And I said, yes, that's 3%, 5% what we need, but do 20 times that, and then we'll be in business. But you kind of came back with this quote and you said, well, wait a minute, maybe sending everything to a QRadar or Splunk isn't the answer. And maybe, can you give me a little more feeling or a little description on why you feel that way, or correct me if I'm wrong?
So I think there's a couple of things to maybe hit on there, but in general, that quote hit me pretty hard too, because for a little bit more context, which will maybe be the theme of the show, context. Dr. Chuvakin, he's like the Gartner analyst for SIEM. With how things have been for years, and that's why he says back in 2003. So for him to sort of make a statement like that is a big deal. And what he means by sort of to your statement, the normalized and taxonomized approach is more of your traditional SIEM, where you've got events, and rather than taking the event sort of in its raw native format, you're translating that or pulling out the pieces to fit within a mold for a SIEM, so that you can build some of these out-of-the-box style dashboards that show you events, so you can get a risk meter, and so you get your traffic light of, oh, am I at okay risk today or bad risk today? Sort of these rails that they put you on is sort of the whole point. The taxonomized and normalized approach puts you on these rails, and when you're on rails, you can do some really cool things. That's why it was done that way. But turns out that when you actually need to get context for things, when you need to do any sort of threat hunting, or anytime you need to leave those rails, you're kind of up a creek without a paddle. And so in more of the IT space, there's been a bit of this battle between normalized taxonomized versus more of a data lake style approach, where you're taking the data in as it is and making it available for searching and things afterwards. And that's sort of, there's a fundamental difference in those approaches from the products out there on the market. And I think that's where some of this comes from. That's why Dr. Chuvakin was interested in Chronicle, because Chronicle was a little bit less on the SIEM side and more on the more towards the data lake.
Well, and this is where I got lost a little bit. So is it a SIEM plus what you're talking about, or are you saying, no, you throw out the SIEM, that taxonomized, normalized approach just isn't worth the effort that you're putting into it?
I think for a certain class of organization, it is more valuable because you're not going to have people really threat hunting. But it does cause an issue when you start talking about incident response, and whether or not you have the information available for incident responders that you might outsource if you have an issue. But it's so there's a little bit of, it depends on your maturity model. But overall, I think, I believe, it's one of the reasons we founded Gravwell,
Sure.
And I'm putting the money where my mouth is I believe that doesn't really take us into the future. We need the ability to sort of sculpt with our data to figure out what's going on, to get the context, to take advantage of our home turf, rather than relying on some third party and what they think we're supposed to care about or whatnot. And that's the thing. It might be worth diving into a little bit to kind of talk about how that differs when it comes to the product. So as an example, like the Splunk OT app, which is sort of like at Gravwell, we call them kits, but it's they're similar things. It's sort of a preset bunch of dashboards or searches or whatnot that get you to a space. And so normally you've got those things that are based on a data source, because if you've got Linux logins, those look different than Windows logins, right? They're XML Windows events versus logs in audit files on the Linux system, but they both describe a login event. And so the data lake approach, which is what Gravwell and Splunk use, is let's take those raw events in their native form, store them, and make them totally searchable as their own thing. But then you kind of build these apps on top that say, well, I know that I can sort of run an automated search that basically translates those logs into a login event. And then once I have things as a login event, then I can correlate cross event types, cross-platform, cloud, and on-prem. Like that's when you start to get all that. But sort of the traditional SIEM is like you only have the normalized taxonomized approach. You only have the logon event, or you've lost some of the underlying data. It's like when you play a telephone game when you're a kid. You start with a message, you tell that to somebody else, and they tell it to somebody else. You lose information in translation, and that's the important sort of distinction in terms of what that enables from a context perspective, from threat hunting, because you're sort of building on top rather than forcing data to fit a mold in the first place.
So a couple of things there. One is, anytime you're doing a presentation or a talk or a show, there's always this commercialization aspect. So you yourself, you started a company, Gravwell, with this belief. And I've always been a little more sympathetic. Maybe it's because I've worked for a product company back in the 90s. But when someone says, I believe in this, I'm going to take a risk and start a company, I do like that. But you're obviously coming at this with a position and an advocate for your position. Yeah, you're biased, right. But it's a bias that you have skin in the game. I guess if you're working for a company, you have a skin in the game, but when you're a founder, it's a little bit more skin in the game. So I think we just want to make sure that's clear. What you're saying is kind of what drove you to start this company.
Right. I'm sure there are people who will disagree, but yeah, that's why it was, I'm obviously biased, but looking to experts like Dr. Chuvakin, looking to sort of trends in the market and what options are out there and available is what I try and do. I think, and a lot of this is informed by my background. I wasn't doing anything in product for years and years. We were finding O-days, and I was working with you to show up on site and help people improve their security. So all this stems out of a background from that. But it's interesting because in the OT space, I mean, you've been putting out the great analysis on the detection products, and that's kind of been the buzz. That's where the focus has generally been. Like, how do we get better detection in OT? But the natural next step is, well, what do we do with these events? How do we plug them into our SOC? How do we get them in our operations? And that's where the log collection, log analysis side of the discussion starts to enter the picture.
Right. So let's dig into that a little bit. Now, you talk about Splunk, and I did a podcast with them last year when they did their OT add-on. And as you describe Splunk, that kind of is the opposite of what their OT add-on is doing. So essentially, they were not getting raw events from the OT world. They were getting asset information that they would put in their asset model in various formats, and then they were getting events, not logs. They weren't getting the raw data. They were getting, let's say, Nozomi saying, "Hey, this was a new communication between this and this." So actually, they were free flowing. I guess they were Nozomi logs. So they were logs in the sense that they were Nozomi logs, but they weren't anything that you could then dig in further to. Is that a little different than the way Splunk usually does it, or is that typical? Is they're just taking logs from any source? In this case, it happens to be Nozomi.
Yeah, there's a little bit of that, and there's a little bit of me sort of maybe oversimplifying, or I was talking about sort of from a fundamental perspective. That's what it is. But as an example, we have utility customers who are using Forescout or Dragos, and so one of the things that we will do as a platform, similar to what Splunk has done, is we'll connect to some of the APIs that they make available for asset information and stuff. So there's additional gravy on top that you can do for event collection to work better with the sensors because you have to meet sensors where they're at, sort of. But yeah, we're talking about fundamentally the goal is take the events from the sensors and make them parsable and interpretable by a human. Is the crux of it, and then there's all that gravy on top.
Okay, so this is really interesting. So I understand why, in a perfect world, if I'm doing incident response, I want the logs. I want as much data as I can. I want logs. Ideally, I want packet captures. I want all the possible information that might be relevant, and I don't know what that's going to be before the
Right.
incident.
Yeah.
Right. I mean,
You don't know
you
what you
just
don't
don't
know.
know what you're going to need. And we do know that in the OT world right now, the amount of logging that is happening, a lot of the logging is turned off. And even where it
It's pretty
exists,
bad, yeah.
it goes away into the ether. But let's say we improve that. So I understand that the value from an incident response capability of somehow gathering all that information and making it searchable later on. That's clear to me. What's not as clear to me is the detection side of it. Well, how, if these other platforms or the SIEM isn't using this normalized and this taxonomy to say when I see this and this and this, it's an event. How do you do detection if you don't do it that way? What's the other choice to that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And so I guess I would first say I think it's really important for the threat detection and the IOCs and the traditional element. I'm not saying that doesn't have a place. I think what I'm saying is that the industry has realized that that's not sufficient by itself. And so there's absolutely a need for sensors. There's absolutely a need for people tracking threat actors, for creating IOCs. But it's going to sound like I'm ambulance chasing, which I'm totally not. But SolarWinds is a good example. When an attacker does a live off the land or is dropping O-days, like, you're not going to have IOCs for this stuff. You have to be able to threat hunt within things. When you're using steganography within XML files for updating, or you're using our mutual good friend Reed Whiteman loves to use TCP over DNS as an example. Like, when you want to dig into some obfuscation or figure out what's going on, like, you have to have the ability to sort of pivot and do that sculpting with data. The more data sciencey style applications, the threat hunting is critical, and that's because of context. When you have IOCs, sort of by nature, they don't have context. They're sort of context independent, which is both an advantage and a disadvantage. And so when you start talking about getting the right data in and collecting it, it's that context. It's being able to take advantage of that. That's important. And I say, at least for people who approach us, or if I'm advising somebody on security, it really depends on the maturity of the organization. There's sort of stages that you go through. Like, step one is just collect the logs, because if you're doing that after an incident, it's kind of too late. If an attacker controls a machine, you can't necessarily trust the logs coming off the machine anymore. So that's sort of step zero. And then it's the next level of the maturity model is at least getting visibility into the logs, getting data out of it. And then sort of the next one is actively going through that information and doing the threat hunting. And depending on where a company is and what kind of resources they've got from a security perspective, they're going to do some or all of those, or move through the maturity model, or outsource some of it before they take it in-house. And that's all dependent on where people are at. But it fundamentally comes down to, you want the tools and the sensors to tell you when there's a known bad quantity going on. And you want the ability to collect those logs and to be able to go back in time, because average dwell time is in some of the studies that come out report 6 months or plus, 6 months or more before anybody even detects that they need to go threat hunting or dig through stuff. And so having the ability to do that is sort of the next step, and the point of the SIEM, the traditional SIEM, the taxonomized approach, isn't sufficient for that activity.
I want to pull on this, a couple other threads that you just said there, but
Sure.
before we leave this topic, I guess the question really is, we took the two very different approaches. One is, you have a set of events and rules to analyze them that generate alerts automatically in your system. And the other extreme is, you get all the logs and you set some really smart people consistently doing threat hunting to look for these attacks. So, I kind of view those as the outside. On the more traditional side, the side that, quite frankly, has been commercially successful. Like, people don't like it when they say, oh, by the way, you got to get all these smart people and pay them a lot of money, and maybe they'll succeed. They prefer to say, let me spend this money on the product, plug it in, and it'll tell me when something bad happens.
It's really attractive to do that. Yeah.
But we have seen many cases in many of these where to get rid of the false positives, to get rid of the noise, you're turning this thing down so low that you're not having to deal with all these events, that it's almost a given that you're going to miss certain things, that you're either going to find these things that are very easy to find, but you're not going to find the interesting, hard to find things, because you're not going to be willing to live with the noise it takes to analyze on this. So I guess I'm wondering, how far along would you go with, I'll cheat and use his first name, Anton's claim that this just is not going to work, that the SIEM approach, because it's actually flies in the face of what I've been recommending and such. So it's a little bit shocking to me to hear, this direction where it sounds very attractive is doomed to fail. Where are you feeling about that?
I'm pretty heavy on the, I concur with that piece. So I'm not a fan of people who, I get the desire to buy something and open the box and then you're done. But that's not going to work. Out of the box only gets you so far. And it gets you to the point that third parties who know nothing about your company or what you do think you should be. They think you should detect brute force attempts on logins this way, which, to be fair, is probably applicable to a large number of people. But you quickly find techniques or approaches that may make sense in for this third party, but they don't in another space. And so I lean pretty heavily. I agree with him pretty heavily when it comes to that, because I don't, at risk of being too vendory, when I guess, and to give some inside baseball, like when we are in a deal up against something like QRadar or ArcSight, it's very easy to see the stark differences in the fundamental approach to analytics of these events, versus if we're in a head-to-head deal with Splunk, as an example. Then it's more interesting for me. I like it more because then we can get into the awesome nuances instead of just covering the basics of where you're at for stuff. So yeah, I agree with him. I think context is ultra important, and in order to do that, you have to have more things. So I am excited for the space. When even kind of throwing back to a few years ago when we did the ICS detection challenge, like we participated in the very first one, which was interesting because we don't do detection. We're not trying to compete with Nozomi or Dragos or in any way, or Forescout, anybody. We want them to send us events, and then we correlate that with things like Windows events that say when a USB was inserted. That's what we want to grab all that stuff and correlate it as our thing. So our participation in that event was almost like we were using open source tools and then collecting the events out of those things into us and sorting through those. So maybe to the point that you said earlier, one of those tools was very, very, very noisy, and basically gave us a whole bunch of data. And so if you're maybe an immature organization, or this is your first foray into that, you're going to think, yeah, I'm going to buy this detection product. It's going to tell me this thing is bad, but it might tell you that thousands of times an hour. And you quickly figure out that, yeah, we're not going to be able to respond to this. But that's all part of the SOC development, SOC process. That's well documented in IT. But for the OT specific sides of it, I think that's still an emerging area. Is that an unfair thing for me to say, or?
Well, no, I think that's fair. But you said that you get information from, let's say, this OT tool and other things from Windows logs and such, and you correlate them. How is that any different than what QRadar does? Isn't that essentially what they do?
Yeah, right. I mean, that's the value prop. The value props aren't necessarily all that different, but I'll tell you the fundamental approach makes a big difference when you start talking about things, because you're talking about like potentially months, sometimes as long as a year, spin up to get everything working in that taxonomized approach. You have to know what you're going to have before you start, versus being able to just stick stuff in and sort of building value over time to get to these answers.
Okay.
Is what it ends up looking like from an implementation perspective.
Okay, I think it's clear in my head. So to me, the difference is really just the data lake is the primary difference. You could
it ends up making
where
a big difference.
where the data lake exists. So something like QRadar says, give us, we're going to get summaries of things. We don't need all that. We don't need to have that data lake, and I guess Splunk and your approach is more, we want all this data because we're going to do a lot of searching through it in ways that are not automated correlated rules. Is that accurate?
Right. You're going to be looking.
You can tell I'm struggling with this. Okay.
No, it's okay. Yeah, it's a different space, and if people don't play in it, then it's not necessarily that apparent. But DNS, let's use TCP over DNS. We'll go back to Reed's favorite technique as an example. So if you're just collecting that, like, you're going to see a bunch of hex in DNS. But if you have a more of a data science approach, you've got a data lake that you can create an analytics pipeline around. You can treat that data as if it's DNS, but then once you've identified this piece, you're sort of crafting additional analytics pipeline that you stick on the back part. So you've got a whole bunch of pipe that describes and looks at DNS analytics, and then you're adding on more pipe that looks at packets and TCP. And so you can then connect that up to all of your packet analytics, which are also in the tool, and it's as if it's not over DNS in the first place. And you can do all the analytics and stuff that you would have done against the packets and treat it as if it was that way. And you just don't have that kind of flexibility if it's not in that data lake style.
Okay. So let me just finish this, and then I want to shift a little bit to the OT products and how they're going to interact with these variety of solutions. But as we're going through this and my prep for this, the way I guess I would view this, and I'm curious if you think this is right or wrong in either direction, but I'd almost view the SIEM, the QRadar, the ArcSight, the whatever rules that come up with it as, in a way, similar to antivirus.
That's a great way to look at it.
They will catch specific things that they are told to catch, but if the person compiles it differently or tweaks it, it's not going to catch it. And that's kind of how I'm viewing now what people are saying about these SIEMs. So that means, yes, they're going to catch mass market attacks that they've gotten threat intel and IOCs and things to find, but they're not going to catch, they're much less likely without human intervention to catch the other stuff.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's a concise and easily relatable way to sort of phrase the discussion. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Now let's talk a little bit, because we've got a set of companies selling products into the ICS space for detection. And the primary way they're getting their information today is passively monitoring switches. So when we were talking about it, we talked a little bit about the SolarWinds example, and you brought up a really good point to me. You're saying, well, that's going to be really hard for a passive detection to find because the XML was encrypted or something of that nature. Do you see, we see some of these protocols, these ICS protocols being wrapped in TLS. Do you see this passive monitoring decreasing in whatever effectiveness it is today over time because of that? Is that a trend that we're going to have to live with?
I think it's going to be a challenge for sure. I mean, you have the same thing in IT. Like, if you want to inspect the contents of HTTPS, you have to use a proxy or some other middle point to decrypt. And I think that's going to end up happening to OT protocols as we're wrapping them in encryption. If we don't use cryptography for validation, but leave it plain text, then we're going to have to, you're going to have something that knows how to decrypt. And when the sensors are driven by span ports, that's just the nature of the problem. As you encrypt more, they're going to have less visibility without other intervention.
So in a perfect world, you'd rather have the logs. I guess the pcaps are useful, but if you had to choose between pcaps and logs, which would you choose?
That's tough, because logs that's the difference in the layers. So logs are the layer 7 application's view of what happened. But one of the things that we would demonstrate at INL and use at the Red Blue exercise that I was helping run for a while is what the HMI thinks is happening is not necessarily what's happening. And the only way to tell what's really happening is the packets. So I think there is still going to be a need for the lower layer capabilities. But I think if I was going to say what we're going to focus on absolutely first, I would say, yeah, we need more layer 7 logging at this point because there's very little.
And I think you're going to run into a world, I mean, this is dating me, but back when I was at NSA, they made us take a course on traffic analysis. So not only what the contents of the packet were, but who was talking to who at what time and such things. And even if it's encrypted, there's probably some value just in knowing what network traffic is taking up in terms of volume. And I think Sophia and some of the other early products, that's really where they focused. Did we have new talkers? Did the volume change? That sort of thing. Okay, last area, because we're almost out of time here. We've got these products now that are monitoring the networks and generating events. And for the most part, their integration with these enterprise or organization-wide tools like Splunk, QRadar, probably your tool now as well, they're primarily just sending their events to the system. I used to get really upset, and maybe I still am, about what I'd say without context. That doesn't seem to bother you as much as it bothers me, because you're gonna figure out the context.
We create the context, yeah.
Yes,
right.
So, so I'm still getting my head around that structure before write and structure before read thing you were telling me. But short of that, I would think you'd want some two-way, unless you're getting all the logs. Wouldn't you want some ability to query them for more information? Like I would say, if I'm seeing this sort of thing, I'd say, hey, by the way, don't just send me events, send me these packets for the next, well, preferably the ones that happened before, but at least send me the ones that are happening now, or send me this log file, or send me all the raw data that caused you to generate that event. Do you see something like that happening with other systems, or is it basically you either get the raw source or you don't get it from an intermediary?
No, I think there's as SOAR is expanding and we're getting more interesting things going on in that space, and how that interacts with tools like ours. I think that is important to be able to reach out to these devices and be like, hey, do you have any more information about this thing that you told me about? But maybe a counter or non-intuitive if you don't work in the data space in that way. Because I'll often see a lot of cloud providers where it's like, hit our web API and we'll tell you more information about this IP. Well, if you're using a tool like ours or Splunk, you might be, and you run a search, there might be 300,000 IPs within 10 minutes or something. You can't hit a web API 300,000 times a second, or you get what I'm saying. So when we talk about sensors and how much data they're willing to put on the sensor versus how much they ship alongside an event is affected by the kinds of things you can do from a SOC perspective. Ideally, you want all of your context in one spot, because that's where you're going to be the most effective without having to go out to do things. But that said, I think I would like to see in the sensor space in OT better ability for tools in the SOC and for context to reach out and ask them about the assets that they've got. What's your knowledge of this asset? What's your knowledge of the history of this? Do you have any context around this event, like the packet capture? Because right now, what we're having to end up doing is, EPRI actually put out a great video showcasing this, but we're having to keep a ring buffer of packets going. And then when an event comes in, then we will grab the context ourselves out of the raw packets and bring the raw packets into our system for correlation. But if a sensor could do that, that'd be, that would be a problem that I think a sensor is sort of better equipped to address rather than us doing it directly for that very specific case. There are other reasons why you might be looking at PCAP directly, but as an example.
Well, and that gets to the last thing we'll talk about is where you store this data. So if we agree that from an incident response standpoint, and probably from a detection standpoint, but certainly at least from an incident response standpoint, we want all these logs. We want as much data. We want as much logs, as much packet capture as we can. Do you keep those at the plant? Do you keep those on the OT network and let a product query that, or say, now send me that? Or do you just ship it all up to the master data lake?
I think, our model is we'll spread out. So you'll have almost like a tributary lake that sits out here. And then that is queryable by the master. And so our model is keep the data where it is, especially if you get into cloud. Like when you need to ship data out of Azure into Google, you're going to have a bad time because they charge you for doing that. But if you keep everything in Azure, then you're good. So that's one of the informers to the way that we built the system, where it's intended to be distributed that way, with where your indexer physically sits. But that said, logically speaking, yeah, you need all that data in one spot. If you're having to have your analysts go here over this tool for do something, and then they need to log into this one over here to look at this other piece, that's not. It's going to slow things down a lot, and you're going to miss stuff. So you need to have that stuff in one spot. So whether you're shipping that all out to the cloud because that's acceptable for you for all the different reasons, or whether you invested in some on-prem storage, those are decisions, right, for leadership to make and risk evaluation and figure out what's the best fit for the company. But logically, I think you absolutely need to have that stuff in one spot.
But I keep thinking more questions here. Last one for real here this time. But if I'm keeping my data on-prem, let's say, I would think I would want to do some automated analysis of that regardless. Even if it's not perfect, I would want to be doing some, and you keep mentioning context. Maybe if I'm a large asset owner, maybe I'm developing some contextual rules that I know work for my site that might not be universal, just to flag something that says I need to look at threat hunters, look here, that sort of thing.
Yep, and that's the power of having all that stuff in one spot. Then you can create some automated searches that do things like, I know my own context for my company. On Mondays between 8 and 12, traffic typically looks like this. Like this is where we start applying machine learning and things as well. And where it gets more interesting is you can do that kind of stuff, drop out the noise floor, and then a port scan is maybe an example. It's a weak signal that is a piece of information that you join together with other pieces of information, which you should be doing automatically. And then if enough of those pieces of information trigger, then that's when a human gets involved. I actually recently did a guest blog at IO Active on kind of weak signals and strong signals. And that was basically the point of that piece. Yeah.
Okay. And so they can find more out about what you do at gravwell.io if you haven't seen that on the screen. Corey, is there anything that we talked about or anything that we didn't talk about related to this conversation that you said it'd be a mistake if the audience didn't hear this?
I think for OT, I've been in OT a long time. There are a number of things where we will follow sort of where IT goes and figure out this technique or this application of whatever. How do we take that and translate it to OT? And you have to sort of follow some of those paths. But I think there are some instances where we can take advantage of IT and jump ahead and not having to make some of the same mistakes. And this is one of those examples. I think we can skip the taxonomized, like how do we force all of our data to fit this event type as people are building out OT SOCs and trying to get better context. I mean, what's the reason why you have an OT SOC versus an IT SOC? There's a lot of potentially political or budget reasons, but one of the reason is that OT people understand the OT environment, and IT people are much less likely to understand the IT environment. So if you're separating them, the reason that you do that is because you want more context. You want better ability to dig within that context and collect from different places. So taking advantage of what IT has learned doesn't work can be a way that we can sort of jump this ahead when it comes to stuff. Because IDS, we've sort of started to get the sensors figured out, as you've been highlighting over the last few years. Like let's kick those sensors into how we run a SOC from an ideal perspective today, instead of trying to pay for something and have it work. Like we have to understand that threat hunting is sort of where you want to get to, because that's what everybody else has learned is ultra important for detecting stuff. And SolarWinds is yet another example of a concrete example affecting this space that really highlights that problem.
Okay. Well, great. Corey, thank you for being the initial guest here on the video version of the show, and I hope everything works out well and I run into you at an event before too long, definitely in 2021.
Yes, yep, absolutely. This has been good. Thanks for having me on the show. I think what you're doing is great, so appreciate the chance to talk for a while.
Well, that's a show. I want to thank my first guest, Corey Thune of Gravwell, for putting up with the first guest issues. I hope you enjoyed it, though. Corey, I'm not sure I agree with you, but it was an important point of view to get out there, and I need to think about it a little bit more. If you have any questions on this episode, you should send them to dale-peterson.com. You see the link up there, and you can hit record your question. On the right-hand side, you'll see the button, and that question will come right to us, and perhaps we'll use it on the next show. I also want to let you know about my Friday news and notes. I'll put that up here. If you take a picture of this QR code, it will take you to a link where you can subscribe to my Friday news and notes. That's where you get maybe the top 10 things that happened that week, as well as anything that we've put out as content. And as always, any questions, comments you have, you can send those to s4@digitalbond.com. And that's it for the first show, and we will see you every Wednesday. At least for the next 20 Wednesdays, I'm committed to putting on a show. Thank you very much.